breaking the hunger habit. In our clinical work, we often associate food issues with eating disorders, but today we're diving deeper into issues that affect most of us and our clients, from emotional eating to mindless eating. These are challenges we've all experienced at some point. Our speaker today will introduce a specific approach inspired by the brand new book, The Hunger Habit, aimed at helping us all move towards healthier eating habits. So thank you for joining us today. Before I introduce our speaker, just a few things. Remember that there is a frequently asked questions section in your portal. There's lots of helpful answers there about troubleshooting technical issues. So make sure to check that out if you're running into any issues. This is a free training, no strings attached. If you are a professional, though, wanting to get continuing education, as well as get the book, The Hunger Habit, a physical copy, please take advantage of the CE and book upgrade in the portal. It's a great deal. It's under 50 bucks. You get the CE and the book. During the training, we also encourage you to please share your questions about the content. Our team will be monitoring the Q&A section, and we'll take breaks throughout the session to address them with our speaker. So without further ado, hopefully I can talk a little more smoothly than before in our introduction. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, who stands as a globally acclaimed addiction psychiatrist and distinguished neuroscientist. Currently, he holds a professorship in both the School of Public Health and the Medical School at Brown University. His viral 2016 TED Talk, titled A Straightforward Method to Overcome Negative Habits, has garnered over 19 million views, and his expertise extends to coaching Olympic athletes, advising government ministers, and guiding business leaders. Furthermore, his initial publication, The Craving Mind, has been translated into over 16 languages. His subsequent book, Unwinding Anxiety, soared to instant success as a New York Times bestseller, and now out, and the inspiration for this training, his most recent book, The Hunger Habit, Why We Eat When We're Not Hungry and How to Stop. Please, everyone, welcome Dr. Jud Brewer.
Great, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here with you all. Just a few housekeeping items, just to give you a lay of the land for the next 3 hours as we spend this time together. I will start with about 45 minutes of background information that will highlight some of the science that my lab's been doing over the last couple of decades that led to the hunger habit. And then we will, after that, we will get into some pragmatics. So keep in mind any case studies that you might have, any challenging issues that you've had in your clinic related to eating, because we'll have some opportunities to bring those forward as well and have some one-on-one discussion around those to apply some of these methods at the end. So we'll start with a little bit of background. We'll get into this 3-step process over the subsequent couple of hours, and then we'll try to save a little bit of time at the end, if there is some time, to really dive deeply into some case studies. So that's the format. As you heard, through the course of this, I'll be opening this up. If you've got technical questions, or if you have specific conceptual questions around concepts that I put forward before we get into the next sections. So don't worry about having to wait until the very end to ask questions. We'll open it up throughout. And then also, because this is 3 hours, we're going to encourage you to take care of yourselves. So there will be some times where we'll have you go into reflection. Often we do this as small groups, but with a large group like this, it's more challenging to do that. So we will probably 3 times throughout the training, there will be a short period of time, maybe about 5 to 10 minutes, where I'll have you do some reflection on your own experience with each step. And during those times, that's a good time to take a bio break if needed. All right, so make sure that you take care of yourself as you go through the training. So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm going to share my screen, and we'll just start with the required disclosure slides that Brown has. So let's get this going. All right. And here we go. Okay, so I will mention a couple of digital therapeutics that over the last couple of years or last decade or so, my lab has developed and has tested. These have been done in a collaboration with a company at first called Mind Sciences that was then merged with ShareCare, which is a digital health company. So anything there has been, all those conflicts of interest are managed by Brown University. Also, I get royalties from books. So as Adrian mentioned, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Unwinding Anxiety. And then most recently, The Hunger Habit just came out last week. And the concepts for this book, we will go through over the course of today's training. Thought I would start with a case study of a patient that I saw a couple of years ago. This patient was referred to me for anxiety. And in fact, he was about 40 years of age, had had symptoms for generalized anxiety disorder probably for the last 30 years. He had started getting anxious when he was pretty young, when he started getting panic attacks. And by the time he came to see me, he was having, he was basically avoiding driving on the highway because of panic attacks. So on top of his anxiety, both panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, he was at a very unhealthy weight. He was about 400 pounds when he came to see me. So how am I going to help somebody with comorbid panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and somebody who's at a very unhealthy weight? I showed this slide because not only do our medications for anxiety not work as well as I would like, the number needed to treat is is 5.2. So about 1 in 5 patients is showing a significant reduction in symptoms. So I'm basically playing the medication lottery. Anytime somebody comes in, I don't know if the medications I prescribe are going to help them or if they're going to be one of the 4 unlucky ones. And then also, I don't know what to do with the other 4. On top of this, in medical school, I learned a very simple formula, which related to weight loss, which was, hey, just make sure you have more calories out than calories in. And this formula is still true today. It is still taught in medical school, just showing this slide is pretty outdated at this point, but these are the most recent data that I could find in a visual format. Despite knowing all of this information, despite having even more knowledge about, unhealthy processed foods, et cetera, clinical obesity rates are trending in the wrong direction. So what is going on here? And this is a place where we will start our exploration today. So I like this quote attributed to Einstein: no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And I like to start with this because this highlights a couple of things that have been very dominant paradigms in psychology for decades. All right. You can, I won't ask for a show of hands, but you can just check in with yourself and ask, are you familiar with the marshmallow test? I would guess that just about everybody that's joining me today can say, yes, I know what the marshmallow test is. Walter Mischel and colleagues at Stanford University did this with pretty young kids. And the idea was, which I'm sure anybody here can explain because it's pretty straightforward. Put a marshmallow in front of a kid and you tell them, if you wait long enough, you can not only eat this one, but I'll give you an extra marshmallow, right? We all know what happens. The kids try to wait for a long time, as you can see from these this video clips, and then eventually they succumb. So I want to highlight this because this has been at the forefront, let's say, of psychological literature in terms of willpower. What Mischel and colleagues suggested, and he wrote a whole book on this, was that, they could predict outcomes much later in life, like in teenage years and even potentially later, based on how long a kid was able to resist. And they came up with all sorts of theories about these strategies that in the 20 seconds that these kids were, asked to hold off, that they were coming up with. And unfortunately, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there were studies that were published just in the last 5 years or so that have really called these into question. And it's not that, you can't watch a kid try to restrain themselves from eating a marshmallow. That's pretty unambiguous, right? You can even see this in the video. But the conclusions that they came to around, being able to restrain oneself early on and attributing this to willpower, that's what's come into question. And so and there have been a number of studies that have gotten into the nuance of this, whether it's a much reduced effect than originally found, so failure to replicate these original results. But one in particular that I want to bring to everybody's attention is that the subset of kids that they reported on much later turned out to be a very privileged group. And so this was done at Stanford. A lot of these kids were, offspring of Stanford professors. And so there was a big, what people have found subsequently is that this has more to do with one's environment and upbringing than one's ability to resist a marshmallow when they are very young. And there's been some very nuanced studies that have been done in this area that I think are really important to keep in mind, which is if you raise a kid in a stable household, then they are more likely to be able to look into the future and say, yes, I have a future. If a kid isn't raised in such a stable household, they're not going to be looking at the future as something that is as assured. And so that's probably, the upbringing, the socioeconomic status, et cetera, probably plays a much greater role in a kid's success than being able to resist a marshmallow when they're young. So I just want to highlight that because it's something that, at least on the internet, is taken as fact, and yet it's really much more a nice story and watching cute kids try to resist marshmallows than science. So I highlight that because that also just highlights what is it that helps us change behaviors? What is it that actually helps us work with any type of habit, whether eating or otherwise? And today we're going to focus on eating habits, but I just want to bring this forward because so much in my clinic have I seen this paradigm of I just need more willpower. I need more willpower. I'm in Weight Watchers or whatever the program, and I have a weekly weigh-in, and I just need to resist this marshmallow or this cookie or this piece of cake. One thing I want to highlight is that this also sets up guilt and shame spirals where people feel like there's something wrong with them and that they just need to somehow get more willpower or be one of the lucky people that is genetically endowed with willpower. And here I want to highlight that this is hugely problematic from a clinical perspective because a lot of patients come to my clinic because they feel like there's been something wrong with them for a long time, and they are perpetuating a story that has been told to them and not been empowered to actually question that. So I would really encourage us to be asking this question, is that true for ourselves? And then if we can see for ourselves that it might not be true, can we help our patients also with that paradigm? Can we help them be able to overcome this dominant paradigm that may actually be more of a story, in terms of willpower being more myth than muscle? So hold that in your mind as we go through this training. And I would welcome any questions about that, especially, after we finish all the training, to see, is it true? How strong is willpower? are there other ways that our brains actually work that are actually stronger than willpower and have more science behind them? And how can we leverage those so that we can move beyond these stories of guilt and shame? So related to this, and I don't want to belabor it too much, but it's important. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. Many of you may have learned about in graduate school or come across the literature first started by Roy Baumeister and colleagues. This was not quite as old as Michelle's work, but it's still a couple of decades old, talking about ego depletion. Also, like the marshmallow test, which is pretty simple, it's a pretty simple paradigm. And the idea is that the longer we go throughout the day, the more our ego gets depleted. And some had attributed this to, this glucose theory, which is a little oversimplistic and has been debunked at this point. But the general idea that I think helped propel this into dominant paradigm territory was that so many people can relate to the fact that they don't eat cookies for breakfast. So if they eat breakfast, they have something, I don't know if you consider cereal a nutritious breakfast, but it's certainly not cookies. And then at night, when they're tired, when they've had a hard day, when they've worked really hard, the likelihood goes way up as in terms of eating some comfort food, whether it's a cookie or some ice cream or some popcorn while they're watching Netflix. So again, sorry to be the bearer of bad news. It's just that I'm a scientist and it's really important that we look at things scientifically. There have been lots of studies looking at this to the point where there have been multiple meta-analyses conducted on this type of work, not only Baumeister's work, but all the people that have been made their careers in this field of ego depletion. And what the data show are that it's about 50% chance that a study is going to be positive or negative. And there's a lot of publication bias in the field suggesting that this actually may not be a true phenomenon. And in fact, there's been a replication crisis in a lot of psychological science. And this original experiment done under rigorous conditions has not been replicated. And I think that non-replication was published over 5 years ago now. So ego depletion, as much as it might make sense, as much as it might seem to fit with our experience, may also be more of a story that we tell ourselves that fits with what we're observing, but it may not actually have the explanatory power in terms of driving behavior. And what I mean by that is that correlation, I'm sure many of us have heard, correlation does not equal causation. And what I mean by that is we might feel like we're depleted at the end of the day. We might eat a cookie, but that may not have might not be driven by this ego depletion or this willpower depletion. So a lot is being called into question around willpower and ego depletion and these foundational, I would say now more mythical psychological studies that have been done that have not been replicated. So where does that leave us? Many of you may be familiar with this face, Oprah, who has documented very openly her struggles with eating over decades, has now come out and talked openly about her basically a lot that she struggled with and this failure of willpower. So she's basically walking back the story around willpower. And I apologize. I think this is actually a Wall Street Journal article, and I wrote in here New York Times. I will double check that. If you're looking for the source, check the Wall Street Journal first. It's either Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Apologies for potentially getting that source wrong. So all this blame, it's coming back to blame. No amount of willpower, as Oprah puts it, is going to control. Now, Oprah's got a lot, she's certainly had a lot of struggles that she has documented throughout her life, but also has tremendous financial resources, for example, now. And even then, that's not going to buy her a bunch of willpower. So where are we left? What are we left with? And what we know, taking my clinical hat off and putting on my neuroscientist hat, one thing that has been documented over and over and is non-controversial is the prefrontal cortex. And I bring this forward for a couple of reasons. One is that the prefrontal cortex, from an evolutionary standpoint, is the youngest and the weakest part of the brain. Two, from a cognitive control standpoint, and again, cognitive control does not equate to willpower. Cognitive control has been studied pretty extensively in neuroscience, but a lot of neuroscientists don't actually use the word willpower when they're studying cognitive control. So willpower, you can think of that as a smaller subset within a larger context of cognitive control. There's been a lot studied looking at cognitive control and decision-making, and that seems to be seated in the prefrontal cortex, in particular, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So why am I bringing the prefrontal cortex to the fore? Well, it's also been shown, Amy Arnsten at Yale and others have shown that the prefrontal cortex is the first part of the brain that goes offline when we get stressed, when we get angry, when we're lonely, when we are anxious, and when we're hungry. And so if we look at willpower, as this paradigm, even if it's something for some people, it may not be that powerful. And so why are we going to rely on the youngest and the weakest part of the brain to help us when it comes to changing eating habits or other habits? So I started asking this question in my lab about, more than a decade ago. And the basic question was, well, what do we know about the brain? What do we know about how habits form? And how can we leverage that information to help us change eating habits and other types of habits? Okay. It is 2024, which is 10 years after a Weight Watchers commercial came out. And this Weight Watchers commercial, which I'm going to show you in a minute, was quickly removed from the air. So somebody found it on YouTube and sent it to me and said, Jud, you got to see this. And when I saw this commercial, I was blown away. And I had an opportunity later, a couple of years after that, I met with the CEO of Weight Watchers at the time. I think they had just rebranded to WW International. So they're not emphasizing the Weight Watchers aspect of it. And she said that, oh yeah, she laughed. She said, oh yeah, that commercial almost tanked the company. So why is that the case? If you're curious, you can speculate after you watch it. So here we go.
If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad because you're angry, feeling down, or generally bad, if you're sad, eat a snack. If you're bored and you know it, eat a snack. If you're lonely and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sleepy and you know it, if you're guilty and you know it, if you're stressed, eat a snack. If you're human and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack.
I love that. if you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack. And so the reason that I found this commercial so compelling, not only was the humor fabulous, but somebody there was a psychologist behind this. Somebody nailed this process. And so one way to think about this process, is we've got, different competing. Let's think of these as networks. So this isn't really, there isn't really a lizard brain from an anatomical perspective, but heuristically, from a explanatory standpoint, it's helpful to think about, that we've got this old survival system, and we've got this newer prefrontal cortex that is involved in thinking, planning, and I'll also add cognitive control. And that commercial really highlights what has been shown forever, this process called positive and negative reinforcement, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. Now, I'm bringing this forward because not only does the commercial highlight all the ways that we can start to associate eating with emotions. I'm using smoking here as well because this has also been heavily studied. But it helps us set up a model that we can start to explore to say, okay, this is non-controversial. Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize back in 2000, showing that this is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. So if this process is at play, can we start to map it out in our lives? Can we start to help our patients and our clients map it out? And can we see what happens when we start to tweak different parts of it? So for example, my patients who struggle with drinking too much alcohol, there's this saying in AA and other circles, people, places, and things. If you avoid cues, you're less likely to drink. To which my patients say, duh, yes, that is true. My patients who are trying to quit smoking, they can't avoid their front porch, their car, their smoke room, all the places that they smoke throughout the day. And so they develop all their strategies, like substitution strategies, eat some carrot sticks or candy instead of smoking a cigarette. But as you can see from this diagram, this gives us a prediction. It says, okay, well, you can avoid cues, but you're not actually dismantling this core loop. The core loop is still in place, whether you're avoiding cues or whether you're substituting behaviors. I'll also add in this aside, most of my patients who try to quit smoking, when they use substitute behaviors, they'll gain about 15 pounds, probably through a combination of the nicotine's effects on the brains, it being a stimulant and having other effects, but also because they're substituting food for cigarettes. And so it's important for us to think through and understand these mechanisms, because it not only helps us be able to map out what's going on in our patients' lives, but it can also help us start to see and predict what strategies are going to be helpful and what strategies might be problematic or run into challenges. To simplify this, this reinforcement learning process has three key elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a result from an experiential standpoint, or we can think of this as a reward from a brain standpoint. And the reason I say that is that the reward comes from it's described because we have this reward system that includes the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and all of these dopaminergically driven pathways that fire when something unexpected happens. So for example, and this is, if we think back to our ancient ancestors who didn't have refrigerators or food delivery, they had to go forage for food. And so they'd be hungry, they'd go out foraging, they'd see some food, they'd eat the food, there's the behavior, and then their stomach would send this dopamine signal to their brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. And so this highlights that reinforcement learning is about learning. Positive and negative reinforcement are about learning behaviors. And once we learn a behavior, we set it up as a habit. I'll talk more about this later. I think of this as set and forget. You set a behavior, you set the reward value of a behavior, and then you forget about the details. This helps us be efficient as we go through our days and our lives so that it frees up brain space to learn new things so that we don't have to be relearning everything every day. Now, this paradigm works so well that the food industry has gotten involved and hired a bunch of scientists and said, hey, how can we leverage this? How can we get people to eat more food, to consume more? Because that will, bring in more revenue. There's a great New York Times Magazine article that was kind of the precursor to a book that Michael Moss wrote over 10 years ago now, where he highlighted all the different ways that the food industry designs food-like objects to get us addicted. And so in modern day, not only do we not have to go very far for food, we can remember where our refrigerator is pretty easily, but we also are inundated with, food engineers trying to get us to consume more, to eat in the absence of hunger. I like that the New York Times used the Doritos as the cover art for their article, because my favorite peer-reviewed journal, The Onion, they had a headline that says, Doritos celebrates its 1 millionth ingredient. And that highlights all the different ways that food can be engineered to have the perfect look, the perfect smell, the perfect mouthfeel, the perfect crunch. Even things like vanishing caloric density. If you think of Cheetos, right? They kind of melt in your mouth. Well, they're designed that way because it tricks your body into thinking that it hasn't actually eaten anything. So it should try doing that again. And it eats again and again and again. So we've got vanishing caloric density. We've got bliss point, where it's that mix between sugar, salt, and fat that, that is most optimal for dopamine firing. Again, I'm not going to go into all of the specifics, but the general idea is that this is something that we're struggling with because there are lots of people out there designing food to make it hard to resist. So resisting a marshmallow in the 1970s was a struggle for kids. Resisting things that are even more engineered in modern day to get us addicted can be even more challenging, not only for kids, but for people like us who were kids in the 70s and now are adults today. Of course, this is not limited to food. We know that social media is designed the same way. So what I want to emphasize here, and the point is that, we've been spending so much time and so much energy on just trying to find these willpower hacks, trying to help people find ways to increase their willpower, that folks have gotten us running around in circles chasing our tails in ways that we have not predicted and not even known. So let's get back in control. And what we'll do today is explore what the neuroscience can help us do to empower ourselves and also power our patients and our clients so that we all can get back in control in ways that are not only scientifically valid, but pragmatic, things that actually work. So just as a little bit of background for this research, my lab started studying mindfulness training back when I finished residency in the mid 2000s. And at the time, there was very little published on mindfulness training. And in fact, I was in residency at Yale, and when I was talking to a colleague about what I wanted to start my lab with as an assistant professor, he told me I was going to kill my career when I talked about studying mindfulness because it was, as you can see from the Waldo cartoon, it was considered hippy dippy, rainbows, unicorns, incense, uh, pseudoscience as at best, but not, not becoming of the rarefied institutions of science. And I remember making a deal with myself that I'd rather kill my career doing something that I was really interested in and passionate about than continue doing, the normal stuff that everybody else was doing. Also, out of full disclosure, I've been meditating about 10 years at that point, and I found it pretty useful for myself. So I didn't want this to be a research is me search project. But I had really been struggling with helping my patients with their addictions, and there wasn't a lot known. And the Buddha talked a lot about addiction and craving. So I figured, why not? We're not really making a lot of progress in the mainstream, so let's go off the beaten track. Mindfulness over the last now, 20 years or so, where the research has started to build up, has become more popular. So many of you may know John Kabat-Zinn's definition. He formed the first scientifically based, or at least scientifically studied, mindfulness training program in the West. His mindfulness-based stress reduction program is now known all over the world. And he opened up his shop at UMass Medical back in 1979. And he talks about mindfulness as paying attention to the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. So for some people, this definition can be a mouthful. If we double click on the elements of this, this awareness, and John often talks about it's the awareness that arises when we pay attention. So if we focus on awareness of being aware of something, and also I like to positively frame the non-judgmental aspect of things. So if we're aware and we're curious, that curiosity can take us a long way. So looking at this from a scientific standpoint, how does mindfulness actually fit with these reinforcement learning models? It's not about avoidance. It's not about substituting something. It's about being aware. And often we talk about this wedge of awareness. If we can bring this wedge of awareness in, it might help us actually break these loops instead of trying to avoid them or distract ourselves. And as an example of how important this is, I had a patient who came in who wanted to quit smoking, and he'd been smoking for 40 years. So we calculated the number of times he had reinforced his smoking habit. You ready for this? So smoking a pack a day, 20 cigarettes in a pack, 40 years. If you just multiply, 40 times 365 times 20, the answer is 293,000. So give or take, he had reinforced his smoking habit a lot, around 300,000 times. And we can just imagine what his lungs look like, but we can also imagine something really important, which was he had no idea how to quit smoking. That's why people tend to come to me not at the beginning of their journey, but when they've exhausted all other avenues. Oh God, now I have to go see an addiction psychiatrist. It must be really bad. So we started just by mapping out this process. And I'm going to show you an example with smoking because this actually led to some of the discoveries we had with eating, but also highlights an essential point. And we published an article on this. Actually, this was a fun article to publish because I wrote it with my meditation teacher, Joseph Goldstein. But the idea was that paying attention, not willpower, but paying attention, that curious awareness will actually change behavior. And in this article, we went back, Jake Davis, who's the middle author on this article, is a Pali scholar. And so we actually went back to the Pali Canon, the Buddhist literature, to look at early examples of people struggling with habits. And there was something really interesting in that was repeated over and over and over. It was talking about becoming disenchanted with our behavior. So we're going to put a bookmark in that because we're going to come back to that pragmatically in step 2 of the training. But one thing I want to highlight is what I did in my clinic. So if somebody came in and wanted to quit smoking, I told them to go ahead and smoke. And they looked at me like, did I hear that correctly? Because my doctor just told me to smoke. Doesn't he know that smoking's bad for me? Yes, I know that smoking's bad for people. They knew that smoking's bad for them. I knew they were going to go ahead and smoke. So I said, well, let's just start by having them pay attention as they smoke. So I sent them home with a simple instruction. I said, I know you're going to smoke. So just pay attention as you smoke and take some notes. What's it smell like? What's it taste like? What's it feel like going into your lungs? And come back to me in a week or 2 weeks and let me know what you discover. And over and over and over, this is what people started reporting. Here's an example. This was somebody we had developed an app early on called Craving to Quit, and had people report on their experience. And this person reported, paying attention as she was smoking. Smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. And I document this a little bit in my TED Talk on a simple way to break a bad habit. But the idea here is that when we bring this ancient psychology from Buddhism together with modern neuroscience, it starts to make sense. And so, stress is a big trigger for smoking. So if we map this out, somebody smokes, but we have them pay attention to how rewarding it is. They start to realize, oh, wait a minute, this isn't quite as good as I thought. Or as Yogi Berra put it, you can observe a lot by watching. So clinically, I was starting to see a signal. I was starting to see that not by telling themselves to quit smoking, not by gritting their teeth, but by simply paying attention, people were starting to change their behavior. And so we developed an 8-session mindfulness training program that really focused on helping people pay attention as they smoked, help them develop some skills to notice what cravings feel like and write them out. We'll talk about some of those. And then we did a randomized controlled trial. And we said, okay, if we're going to study this, let's study this the right way. So we compared it to the gold standard treatment. And the gold standard at the time, it may still be, but this 10 years ago, was the American Lung Association's Freedom from Smoking, which is a cognitively based training. And so we could carefully match these for the number of sessions. We could even randomize people, per cohort to get, this group goes in this room this month and this group, and then they switch. So we could really carefully control our experiment to make sure that we were getting at any signal. And we were blown away by how strong the signal was. In fact, when we first submitted some of our mechanistic results for publication, one of the reviewers came back and said, this can't be true. You don't have a large enough sample size. We responded, effect sizes can be dependent on a large sample. If you have a small effect, or if you've got a large effect, you don't need as many participants to actually get a large effect. And so we got a very large effect. If you calculate this out, this is actually 5 times the quit rates at our 17-week follow-up, 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. And I won't go into all of the specifics with the smoking studies because we're focusing on eating today. But basically what we found mechanistically was that mindfulness does break this link. It decouples the urge and the behavior. And we found that there's actually a delayed effect. Cravings still stay strong at the end of treatment for people that quit smoking, but those cravings die off over time as they learn to write out their cravings, and they don't fuel future cravings with cigarettes. So this was, a while ago now that we started developing these programs. And when we did the in-person training, we started asking the question, okay, this seems to be, effective, we need to replicate it, but we also want to see how we can scale this. How can we get this out to other clinicians? I was working at the VA hospital at the time. I was a one-person show, and so you couldn't see all the people that wanted to quit smoking in the world. So we started asking questions, and one of my mentors, Kathy Carroll, who's a very well-known and respected addiction researcher, she's a psychologist by training. She had been looking at cognitive behavioral therapy and ways to put it online. So she started delivering it on the internet. Again, this is back in 2011, 2012. So right when iPhones were just starting to roll out and Androids didn't even look like phones. They looked like large, clunky Texas Instrument calculators. And so smartphones were just beginning to be rolled out. And so we started asking the question, well, is this a thing? It turns out the smartphones were a thing. And so we started asking the question, can we develop apps that instead of deliver Angry Birds or some other video game to people's phones, this is also the time when people were just starting to deliver social media to people's phones. To all of our detriment, we would soon find out. Can we actually deliver treatment? So can we take evidence-based trainings? Can we cut them into bite-sized pieces? And can we deliver them through someone's phone? So we started first with this smoking program called Craving to Quit, and then this eating program called Eat Right Now, and then even developed an anxiety program called Unwinding Anxiety, where I won't go into the details of the anxiety program. I detail all that in the Unwinding Anxiety book, but just to highlight one of our randomized controlled trials, because I'm still blown away by this, and we've replicated our results at this point. We did a randomized controlled trial of people with generalized anxiety disorder, so the worst of the worst, and we basically tried to do this in a clinical setting. So we said, okay, what if we just add in an app and say, hey, try the app in addition to your usual clinical care. So you can get your therapy, you can get your medications, you can do whatever you're doing, because we wanted to be ethical about this. We said, how much will it add anything? And what we found at our 2-month endpoint, that was our primary endpoint, was that we got a 67% reduction in GAD-7 symptoms as compared to 14% in the treatment as usual. So 67%. So that number needed to treat was only 1.6 as compared to usual care, which is, it's 5.2. And that we actually had somewhat replicated that 14% is close to about, 1 in 5. And our remission rates were astounding. I think we had a 64% remission, where it was like 3%, 0 or 3% or something. I'm sorry, I should know this better than I do. But we had astounding remission rates because people were learning to work with their brains. And that led to me writing this Unwinding Anxiety book, because I was blown away and I wanted people to know how that worked. So long story short, it seems that, at the time we had started developing the smoking program, and we said, we've got some pilot testers in, because user-centered design is really important for developing any type of let's say a product. And so our pilot testers were testing out the smoking program. They said, yeah. And I'm also changing my eating habits. And at first I just made the assumption that they were substituting eating for smoking. And thankfully they corrected me and said, no, I'm actually applying these tools that you're using to help people quit smoking to help me with my snacking. And that was a big light bulb moment for me, because I hadn't really been studying eating as a habit. As a psychiatrist, I'd mostly been focused on addictions. I'd been focused on anxiety and things like that. But it made me pause and see if there was something to this. And that's actually where I realized and learned that this positive and negative reinforcement process was actually, is really set up to help us remember where food is. We needed food way before, and nobody ever needs a cigarette. But these mechanisms were set up for eating way before people learned to refine substances to make them addictive, whether it was coca leaves into cocaine, growing tobacco for nicotine, distilling alcohol, you name it, right? All of these things are refined. They're manufactured to be addictive. The addictive substances do not exist in nature. Coca leaves are not addictive. It's only when we learn to, pull the sugar out of the plant or the fruit that's when problems happen. So I won't belabor the point, but we started, this is where this whole journey, this is over 10 years ago now, this whole journey around eating began for us. And one thing that we wanted to do early on as we were developing these apps was to make sure that we had a community where people could support each other, and also I could go on the community and answer questions. And even back then, this is 2014, we started using Zoom, 2014, before most people even knew what Zoom was. We started holding weekly groups for anybody that was in any of the programs so they could join us live and they could ask questions, and we could work through, struggles that they might be having. So we found that online communities were really helpful, found that live groups really helpful. And I'll just highlight, how I started working with eating in my own clinic and also starting to research it. So I'll use a case study. A patient who was about 30 years of age when she came to see me, and she described how she developed binge eating, where she would eat entire large pizzas in one sitting. And she was doing this 20 out of 30 days a month. And what she described to me was that she was the daughter of folks who were refugees from the Khmer Rouge genocide. They had fortunately made it to the United States, away from the atrocities there. Yet you can imagine her mother probably had a lot of psychological scars and started abusing her emotionally when she was about 8. And the only thing that she felt that she had control over at the time was eating. So she started to eat as a way to work with her emotions. And as she put it, she would eat to numb herself. So by the time she came to see me, she was completely out of control. And you can see, what she was trying to fill with the eating, but it wasn't working. And she had no idea how her mind worked. On top of this, so she'd have a binge eating episode, and this binge eating would, she'd feel guilty about it afterwards. And that guilt, because it was also emotionally felt unpleasant, would actually sometimes trigger another binge. I think of this as an echo binge, where she'd binge on top of a binge, because that was the only mechanism she knew. So we started developing an eating program to see if we could help people break free from these cycles. And in fact, when I first started working with patients in my clinic, I set up a group medical visit for people with binge eating disorder. And I spent I remember the first month, and I write a bit about this in The Hunger Habit. I spent a bunch of the first month just trying to understand what my patients were talking about, because I had assumed that they could tell when they were hungry. And in fact, as one patient put it, she said, "I have an urge and I eat." And I just assumed that urge was because of her stomach rumbling or something telling her that she needed some food. And so, we go back and forth, and I finally realized that, there was this miswiring where she didn't know if that urge meant hunger or if it meant emotion. And in fact, I don't know when this term was first developed. It wasn't that long ago. There's a whole term that's a misnomer, but it's used to study this phenomenon. It's called hedonic hunger. Many of you may know this term. It's a misnomer because we're eating in the absence of hunger. So it's not actual hunger. but it's eating because of an emotion, right? That's where the hedonic comes in. It's some feeling tone. That feeling tone can be pleasant, celebration, or it can be unpleasant, like my patient who was struggling with her negative emotions. And that unpleasant emotion was triggering her to say, hey, this is uncomfortable, make this go away. And she learned, oh, if I eat food, I can numb myself. She had no idea how her mind worked. So we started developing this program to see if we could actually target that specific mechanism like we had been able to target with smoking. Could we target eating in the same way? And I don't want this to sound like an infomercial, so, but I'm just going to mention the app is what we actually studied so that I could say, okay, this is legit. And it seems to be, we can study this in randomized controlled trials, et cetera, to see how well it works. I'll just mention that this is now a CDC recognized diabetes prevention program, the first that really focuses on mindful awareness as the core mechanism as compared to what's been used in the standardly for the last 30, 40 years around willpower-based approaches. We collaborated with Ashley Mason at UCSF, who's a brilliant psychologist and researcher. And she did a first mechanistic study of the Eat Right Now program to see if we could actually target craving-related eating. Could we actually get at these same mechanisms that we were seeing with smoking? And I won't belabor the point. This is published over 5 years ago now. But she found a 40% reduction in craving-related eating and a 35% reduction in eating to cope with negative emotions. And she used experience sampling, so really sampling people's direct experience in their daily lives to come up with these data, which makes it a little more ecologically valid. And so what this suggests is that if we actually know how our brains and know how our minds work, that puts us in the driver's seat. That gives us a tremendous amount of power and, dare I say, control to actually work with our experience. And so I'm just going to take maybe 10 minutes, and apologies for taking such a long time with this background piece. We take 10 minutes and just talk about some of the neuroscience behind this, and then we're going to get into the pragmatics. So there's, I like the story of Lolo Jones, amazing athlete, three-time Olympian. Back in 2008, this is when the Olympics were in Beijing. She was favored to win the 100-meter hurdles, okay? She was favored by a lot. And in fact, she had blasted through all the preliminary rounds, made it to the finals, and she was leading the race. She was at the 9th of 10 hurdles, right? And in an interview with Time Magazine, she said, I was just in an amazing rhythm. And then I knew at one point I was winning the race. I wasn't like, oh, I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race. And then there was a point after that where I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out. So I overtried. That's when I hit the hurdle. I highlight this tragic story because it points to something really important where we get in our own way, as one teacher put it. And we can think of this as getting caught up in our own experience. So we can get caught up in daydreaming. Studies have shown this happens about 50% of waking life, but we can snap out of it. If somebody says, hey, are you paying attention? We're back. Get caught up in stress, a little harder to do. It'd be great if we could just say, stop being stressed, and then we'd stop. And at the far end of the spectrum, addiction. I've learned this simple definition of addiction: continued use despite adverse consequences. So we could be fully aware of what we're doing and not be able to stop. And this is where a lot of people have put forward this notion that eating can actually fall into the addictive spectrum, where we know we're eating despite adverse consequences, whether they're health, physical health, emotional health, or both, yet feel like we're completely out of control. And in fact, we can map this onto the brain because we get caught up in our experience so much. There's a network of brain regions. Many of you may be familiar with this because it's been talked about so much in the literature, because it is a very solid and reproduced finding. It's called the default mode network. Don't worry about the details, but I'm going to highlight two regions here, the posterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex. These are yellow because they're hubs of the default mode network. And these hubs show up over and over and over in different scientific studies. So for example, in a study of adolescents, this is done at UCLA a little while ago now, where they showed adolescents their own Instagram feeds, and they arbitrarily assigned some pictures likes and some pictures, more likes than others. And what they found was that they were activating these reward pathways in nucleus accumbens, but they were also activating these self-referential networks, the posterior cingulate being the hub here. And so over time, people have figured out that this network is involved in self-reference. So when we think about ourselves in the past or the future, when we, if we're addicted to substances like cocaine, and we're shown pictures of cocaine, cocaine consumption, these activate. You see the posterior cingulate here. Also happens with smoking. Amy Janes, who's now at the NIMH, has developed this wonderful smoking cue reactivity paradigm. We've actually collaborated, showing that we can target this network with our smoking program. I won't talk about that today. But this gets activated, it lights up like a Christmas tree when people are shown smoking cue reactivity pictures. Gambling, same thing. People who are addicted to gambling, when they're shown gambling scenes, it activates. And even, this is one of my favorite studies, I highlight it in the hunger habit. Dina Small, who's a food researcher at Yale, for her PhD thesis, she put people in a PET scanner. And PET scanner is a little more forgiving when it comes to head motion. And so she could actually feed people chocolate. So she let them pick their favorite chocolate, and she started feeding them chocolate. And they would just rate how good it was on a -10 to 10 scale as she fed them, and she could scan their brain. What she found at the beginning makes sense. Oh, wow, I'm getting fed my favorite chocolate, 10 out of 10. I really want another piece. And she would feed them and feed them and feed them. I won't give away the punchline of the story in terms of who ate the most, but I will highlight a couple of things. One is that at both ends of the spectrum, 10 out of 10 and -10 out of -10, when they were eating way past satiety, they were activating their posterior cingulate cortex. So there seems to be something about wanting more and wanting less that is consistently correlated with brain activity. And I'll just highlight that this isn't just limited to consumption, whether it's substances or food, but also we see this psychologically. So the more somebody worries, the more they activate both their medial prefrontal cortex and their posterior cingulate. So a while ago, we started asking the question, what's the PCC got to do with it? Is it involved in getting caught up in our experience? And we could actually test this by bringing people in who were meditators versus non-meditators, and we had this hypothesis that meditation would actually help people not get caught up in their experience, not get caught up in that urge or the worry or the rumination or whatever, and that this would reflect in differential brain activity. I will go through this quickly because we published this a long time ago, but we found that experienced meditators across 3 different types of meditation consistently deactivated these 2 hubs of the default mode network relative to novices. So here, this network was getting less active in experienced meditators, suggesting that this self-referential network has, is, or can be, let's think of it this way, it can be affected by how we relate to ourselves. And I'll show you an example. A couple of years ago, we were fortunate enough to have Anderson Cooper come in and try this out in the lab as we were developing some neurofeedback methodologies. And he was doing a study, or he's doing a 60 minutes piece on meditation. And here's what his brain looked like.
This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical, exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with conduction gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up electrical signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I'd been meditating daily and was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay.
When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay.
When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, but he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
Okay, so I'm going to pause here. I'm going to open it up for questions. So if you've got a specific question related to what I just presented, so the conceptual piece of things, you can go ahead and put those in the chat, and our team can read them out to me, and I can answer them. So again, the clinical case study stuff, we'll save that for later when we get into the pragmatics. This is really about what I just presented. Do you have any questions about this? I want to make sure everybody is clear on the background before we go on to the pragmatics. You're on mute, Adrian. Yeah.
Sounds good. I'm going to try and not get too specific, but you can guide me out if I tend to go there. Let's see here. So lots of good questions. So one thing, you talked about the controversy with the ego depletion, and, maybe my ego isn't depleted at night, but like my 3-year-old's home and my 7-year-old's home, and everyone needs baths and food, and I'm stressed, and now I want chocolate cake, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more and expand on the connection between stress and our food cravings?
I'd be happy to. And I think that's, this will actually help us lead into the pragmatic piece. So thanks for that question. So what we do, so I set us up to understand what these learned mechanisms are around positive and negative reinforcement. And so from a survival standpoint, we learn to remember where food is. And we also learn that's positive reinforcement, but we also learn to avoid danger. And so if something's dangerous, we learn don't go there. And I gave an example, but I didn't explicitly talk about this. So with my patient with binge eating disorder, she had gotten her wires crossed where she learned something unpleasant happens. My mom does something mean to me. That doesn't feel good. And so I can learn that I can eat food to numb myself. And so that's where we start to develop eating habits through negative reinforcement. For her, it was a way to numb herself because that was the only thing her 8-year-old brain felt like it had control over. For many people, this becomes stress eating, comfort eating, bored eating, mindless eating, where they just, the joke about the seafood, eat food diet. And this can even be overeating, where we as a kid learned to be part of the clean plate club. And so we just learned to finish our plate, and it feels better to finish our plate than not to. One thing I'll highlight here is, and this is not meant for parents to feel ashamed, but a lot of parents do not know these mechanisms. And so they they inadvertently train their kids that food is a reward for something. So if you eat all your dinner, you get dessert, right? It's not about hunger. It's about eating all your dinner. Or a kid throws a tantrum in the grocery store and the parent says, hey, if you quiet down, I'll give you a lollipop on the way out the door. And so the kids learn subconsciously, oh, I get a treat if I do this or if I don't do that. And so often we learn these through negative reinforcement. We also learn to eat food when we're not hungry, when we're at birthday parties. So as a kid, our parents don't say, I'm gonna hold off on breakfast and lunch because I know my kid's going to a birthday party and I want them to fill up on cake and ice cream. No parent's gonna do that. So kids learn, oh, celebration, and we learn to eat cake and ice cream not when we're hungry, but when we're at a party and having fun, and because ice cream and cake taste good. So it's not that everything goes back to our childhood, but we can certainly look to see how these habits get set up, whether it's in childhood or adulthood. I've plenty of patients who set up unhealthy eating habits as adults when they start, a person that I describe in the book who started pounding carrots in graduate school when she was really stressed with some of her assignments. And so we can learn to eat in ways that are outside of the hunger windows through these positive and negative reinforcement pathways. Does that get at the question?
Yeah, I think so. We have another question here where somebody is wondering, and this is maybe a follow-up to what you were just talking about, is do we need to know the root cause for mindless, disorder, dysfunctional eating? Do you work on that with clients regularly, or do you just start where they're at?
What a great question. Okay. So, I'm board certified card carrying psychiatrist, right? And so I've been trained in psychotherapy. Yet my neuroscience hat says, and we'll get into this, but the don't go away, stay tuned for part 2, is that the equations don't depend on history. So the habit gets set up, and then how we change it is based on how we work with it now. And so for a lot of people, honoring their history, honoring their former self is really important, but it's not critical for change. If somebody's like, I don't want to go there, we don't have to, because we can go here and this is where the behavior change happens. I can't force somebody to go here. If they say, I got to figure this out, great, we'll figure it out. But we can't spend all the time here because that distracts us from actual change. So I'm glad that person asked the question, because often people think, I got to be in therapy for 20 years.
Yeah.
No. I'll talk about one of our studies where habit change happens pretty quickly. I'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, it's liberating to be able to start where you are. And for us as therapists, part of that storytelling is part of the building of the relationship sometimes for some folks. So we can honor it, like you're saying, and be with them in those connections, but it's not necessary in order to produce the change or move towards something new. So yeah, I like being able to do both. Can you speak, and you talked about this a moment ago, can you speak a little more to the overlap between binge eating disorder and being addicted to food? Are you saying that they are basically the same thing?
Good question. They're not the same thing. So there are specific criteria, the DSM for what it's worth. I'll go on record for saying I'm not sure that it's the best scientifically based document. But
you're breaking hearts here, by the way.
Yeah. It's developed for billing purposes and is still used to some degree for some things. So if you look at the DSM, check. We all know that people aren't checklists, but that it encompasses a lot of elements that are involved in binge eating. And there's some overlap with addiction, right? That out of control element, the continued use despite adverse consequences. But I'm not saying they're the same thing. And in fact, eating, food addiction is still controversial in the scientific field. As a scientist, we can debate stuff all day and night. As a clinician, I'm like, how am I going to help my patient? Right. So, and I'm sure lots of folks here are like, let the researchers fight amongst themselves. They're not actually out there in the trenches helping people. I mean, maybe some of their theories at some point will help people. And, and some are very helpful, right? That's why my lab does science, to try to figure out what are the best treatments to develop. But at the end of the day, it's about meeting my patients where they're at and helping them navigate their lives. And so I like the simple definition of addiction, that continued use despite adverse consequences, because eating can fall into that category. It can fall into that definition. And in fact, the American Association of Addiction Medicine, or whatever acronyms I can never remember, they still have that definition that I learned in residency, virtually unchanged. And so if you just look at the strict definition, you could say, yeah, eating can fall into that. Continued use, you're eating when you're not hungry. There are adverse consequences because you've got mental and physical, adverse consequences. Like, for example, my patient that I mentioned, he was 400 pounds. He had obstructive sleep apnea. He had a fatty liver. He had hypertension. So, and he was psychologically a mess when he came to see me. And all of that, a lot of that related to his, he described it as being addicted to fast food.
Mm-hmm. So related to that, folks are asking questions related to, and let me know if this is getting too far, into the weeds, but weight loss medications, weight loss surgery, things where the body changes so quickly, right? And I don't know what kinds of impacts that has on the brain and our ability to kind of regulate cravings over a fast period of time. Are you going to talk about that? Do you want to speak to that now?
I'll speak to it now because I won't go into it in detail with the training. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the GLP-1 drugs, for example, because they are, they've been catching headlines for the last year. And and I've even had patients who have come in and who have said, I just feel like the noise, the cravings have really reduced. And so these drugs have been shown to act in the brain, in these reward centers. And so that's consistent with what people are finding. And unfortunately for this patient, and I'm not saying this is generally the case, but after about 4 months, she said it stopped doing that. Yeah. And so one thing that we do know is that our brains are very adaptable. So they're going to adapt to a changing environment, whether it's getting bariatric surgery or, taking medication. Think all the benzos, for example. Yeah. Most people have to, increase the dose because they become tolerant to them. So I don't know what happened with this patient, but I do know that these drugs are so new that we don't know what the long-term effects are. Nobody knows. You just have to wait 10 years and hope that we're not, finding something terrible happening. And again, I'm not advocating or I'm agnostic, because with the medications. What I will say with those is that so for some people, medications can be helpful. For everyone, learning how their mind works and how to work with it is essential. So I'm focusing on that piece, even as a neuroscientist, that I like to understand the neuroscience. Nobody's found a magic bullet yet. These GLP-1 drugs are the closest that I've seen. Some folks might remember things like fen and some of these other drugs that were pulled from the market because they were dangerous. So, I think the safest, but also something we can do in parallel, is to really learn how to work with our minds. With things like bariatric surgery, that's been around long enough that people have pretty consistently documented that often people will we call this clinically eating through their surgery. Meaning that somebody gets bariatric surgery, they lose a bunch of weight, and then they start to regain that weight because their body has figured out ways to bypass the fact that their stomach is, the size of a straw now, basically. And so for some people, bariatric surgery is a godsend. For a lot of people, unfortunately, they're looking, it's another unfortunate quote unquote magic bullet that they're looking for. They risk, they go through all the risks of surgery, and then it may not actually be effective for them. So again, even people with bariatric surgery, if they could learn how to work with their minds, I think we could see greater efficacy long-term with these surgeries. I just haven't seen a lot of effective behavioral interventions that have been done in conjunction with bariatric surgery. We're starting to talk with some bariatric surgery centers around, doing the non-willpower based approaches, but there haven't been any studies done on those yet.
Our adaptability is such a double-edged sword sometimes.
Totally. Absolutely.
Let's do one more question if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. In the clinical world, we have this fat positive intuitive eating movement happening. Can you talk about if you have any thoughts on envisioning the future of therapeutic interventions, addressing food related struggles, et cetera, how this kind of evolves alongside this intuitive eating fat positive movement?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so a lot of our research is very aligned with intuitive eating. So, and I like the simplicity of the principles. I think they have 10 guidelines. I don't like to say rules because one of their guidelines is no food rules. Right. So I think what I'll present in the next, period of time is that our research is actually supporting a lot of what the intuitive eating folks have highlighted. With the fat positive movement, I think it's a really helpful step forward in terms of what our societal conditioning has been, which is basically, you can sum it up in the Kate Moss quote, nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. And skinny feels good, not because it truly feels good, but because society says, hey, it's better to feel skinny from a relational standpoint than an individual standpoint.
And like a trained feel of goodness, not organic.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the fat positive movement is a really positive step forward in helping us change that narrative. And I have to say, clinicians are really struggling a lot with this. Clinicians and researchers alike. There was I did a podcast with Tara Brock a little while ago where we talked about there's a physician that wrote this very insightful article. And I mention that because I can't remember the physician's name, but if somebody wants the details, they can listen to the podcast, where this physician who is fat was talking about his struggles with how to deal with this because he has patients whose weight is affecting their health. And so it's like the term obesity can be shaming for people and stigmatizing. And so he's talking very eloquently about, the term obesity is probably not going to be the fix. Some clinicians are playing with the term clinical obesity to highlight that, hey, we're talking like when it's affecting somebody's, health. But even then it's got the word obesity in there and it's like somebody hears the word obesity and they stop there. I'm playing, and I'm not saying this is right or good or the best way to go. I'm trying to play with moving as much away from concept into direct experience as possible. So, like, for example, when I talk about my patient, I talk about his weight was affecting his health. And so weight is less stigmatizing because it's more of an objective. It's like, I weigh X, Y, or Z. As compared to obesity, which is an interpretation of, and the very non-helpful, BMI, where it's weight times height, that's shown to be tremendously not helpful from a clinical or scientific standpoint, right? That's where a lot of the problems happen, where a lot of people, they're healthy at a certain BMI, but some BMI chart says, no, you're obese. And that's just not helpful at all. So, the long story short, I think this is an evolving conversation, and it's a conversation we all need to have, and have honestly and openly with ourselves and with our clients and with society and with our policymakers. And importantly, remember what it comes back down to, which is that we're human, right? And so even, I'm not a big fan of the DSM. I think the only condition that I truly think is real for all of us is the human condition, right? And so if we can focus on like what's the issue as compared to what's a label, then we can help not trigger stigmatization or shame, so that people close down when on it, as clinicians, we're just trying to be helpful, and we might not know that we're not being helpful just through our own ignorance.
Yeah. And it's been such a strong conditioned connection, health and weight. They're just stuck together, right? In a very unnuanced kind of way. And so I think as a field, we're trying to figure out how to talk about it in a more nuanced way. Where all of these health conditions are not necessarily tied to weight, right? They can be health conditions separate from weight, but that's kind of new for us. And the language around that, I think, is still evolving.
Absolutely. If I'm just to be perfectly frank and honest and transparent, even, I was, as a kid growing up, like the word fat was like, ooh, can I say that? And so like, even now, as I'm trying to get used to, if somebody is comfortable, they're like, yeah, I'm fat, or I'm chubby, or I'm this, or I'm that, like meeting them where they're at and noticing the internal habitual cringe at me saying something like, oh, that person's fat.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because I've just been conditioned not to talk, not to say it.
Sure.
And so that's where I am. And just trying to explore this in an open way, knowing that I'm going to fall on my face a gazillion times. And the more, I learn more from falling on my face than from getting things right.
Yeah, I hear you on that. And thanks for sharing your own process associated with that. I really appreciate that. And Virgie Tover, she's a fat positive advocate. She'll have a room full of people and everybody has to say fat, 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 fat over and over again until it just starts to we shake off some of that conditioning that is in our society and that we grew up with. So thank you so much for saying that.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
I'm going to go in my bathroom and do that every day.
That's awesome.
In the mirror.
All right. Well, I'll let you keep rolling. How does that sound for now?
Great.
All right. Keep the questions coming in, everyone. These are awesome questions. And I see even more coming in as we chat. So I'll be looking through the Q&A. And so thanks everyone for your great questions.
Yeah. And can you just double check for conceptual questions? Because we're going to move into the pragmatic now. And I don't want somebody lost at the concept.
Yes.
So just double check that as I start queuing up this next section. And if there are any other mop-ups, happy to take one or two more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll be back on in a little while.
Okay. So let's get into the pragmatics, right? I'm going to take my neuroscience hat off, put on my clinician hat, and talk about, some of the struggles I've had in my clinic. And then what we started to notice in terms of how people are actually changing behavior. So the way we'll frame this next part is that we're going to split this into 3 sections, and we will talk about a concept. But the only way that a concept actually makes it into our real life is by the development of wisdom. And that critical intermediate step is experience. So I'm going to talk about a concept quickly. We're going to open it up for questions and make sure the concept is clear. I'm going to have you do your own personal little breakout group with yourself. We're going to come back and share some of those stories to make sure that it's clear with each step before we move on to the next one. So this 3-step process, we'll repeat this 3 times. I will share my screen and start with the first step. Actually, before we do that, I'll just give you the overview of all 3 steps. Okay, there it is. All right. So first step, awareness of being caught up in a habit loop. So I'm just laid these out and then we're going to go through these in detail. So we've got to be aware. We've got to know how our mind works before we can work with our mind. Second step, we've got to explore the results of the behavior. This is not about willpower. Notice how this question that we ask is not, how do I stop? Third step, you'll see some of these, if you've practiced mindfulness, some of these might look familiar. And we'll go into some specifics here, but this is not an exhaustive list. It doesn't have to be a mindfulness practice. We have just found that these are helpful, and I'll talk about why. But once you understand the principle behind how the third step works, you'll be able to find what else might work beyond these mindfulness practices. All right, so let's simplify this. Okay, 3 steps of habit change. Ready? Awareness. 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 All right, so if you don't remember anything else from this training, just remember it's all about awareness, or you can think of this as curiosity. All right? Got that? You can tattoo it on your forehead backwards, so you look in the mirror in the morning, you'll remember all you need to know. So I'll give you an example of the first step. And the idea is we've got to recognize habit loops. We've got to be able to map them out, right? I'm going to show you an example of somebody mapping one out. And I'm going to talk about how we can actually simplify this. And then I'm going to have you go map out your own loops, right? So here's somebody in our You Right Now program that said, I understand why I go to food to avoid or cover up or distract from uncomfortable feelings such as anger, sadness, or restlessness. Who wants to feel those things? Trigger, uncomfortable feeling, behavior, eat something that temporarily diminishes the feeling. Reward, still have to deal with the unpleasant feelings plus the sugar headache. I can clearly see how I got caught in this habit loop trying to escape difficult feelings with food, but that ultimately it doesn't work. Okay. So remember, any habit loop, trigger, behavior, reward, or result. Okay. And you can see that this is a negatively reinforced process for this person, right? They go to food because the uncomfortable feelings such as anger, sadness, or restlessness trigger eating. And then they're actually starting to notice what gets into the second step is that, wait, this isn't actually as rewarding as I thought. But the critical piece is just being able to map this out. Now, I'm going to highlight something that I've already said a couple of controversial things, so I'm just going to go for it. The triggers are the least important part of the equation. And so often my patients will come in therapy and they're conditioned, or they think that they just got to figure out why it is that they're eating. The why is the least important part of the equation. That's not what drives these habit loops. It's called reward-based learning because if a behavior is rewarding, we're going to keep doing it. If it's not rewarding, we're going to stop. And we'll get into that when we talk about the second step. But the reason I mention that now is that the trigger is just the thing that sets it off. And for most of us, we can't avoid the triggers. If it's a family member, if it's work, if it's email, whatever, this isn't about going and living on some desert island that doesn't have all of our triggers. It's about learning how to work with our mind so that we can learn to work with our mind and make it work for us. So just to make this very clear, my patient, right, with binge eating disorder, let's map out her habit loop around eating. So she'd have these negative emotions, she would binge, and then she would numb herself, which would give her temporary relief. And as I mentioned before, that temporary relief, because it was only temporary, would often result in guilt and shame and other negative emotions, which then just set the whole loop in motion again. So that's the first step. Okay. That's the first step. It's pretty simple. There's not a lot more to say about it. It's about mapping out these habit loops. If we can't map them out, we can't work with them. I'll give one more example, and then I'll open it up for questions about this first step. And then I'm going to have you do an exercise where you're going to map out a couple yourselves. So my patient who came in with anxiety, who was 400 pounds and had a lot of negative health results from this, we started mapping out his panic attack habit loops around driving. And I sent him home to map out his other anxiety habit loops. Had him follow up in 2 weeks. And he comes back and he says, okay, anxiety triggers me to eat fast food. And then said the result was I actually get more health anxiety. So he had a lot of health anxiety. And so this starts to help map out the territory, but also gives us a hint for how change happens. So I just want to put that as a placeholder, because we're going to talk about how critical that was for him changing his behavior. So I want to just open it up now. I'm going to stop my share. Are there any questions about this first step, mapping out these eating habit loops? Actually, before we do that, I'll add one thing. Sometimes it can be helpful to ask this simple question: why am I reaching for food? Not what is it in my childhood that set this habit up, but am I actually hungry, or is it something else? Why am I reaching for food? And then we can map out the behavior as stress eating, bored eating, overeating, whatever. And then we can start to map out what the result is, and also map back to, if we can identify the trigger, what that was. So any questions about this first step? It's pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward. So just maybe a couple clarifying things. How is the beginning of this mapping different than finding triggers?
The beginning, so if you begin the mapping with the triggers, it's the same.
Okay.
I mentioned that you can start at the behavior and ask, why am I reaching for food? Because often that trigger is already passed. If it's a thought or an emotion, we might not have noticed it, but we can see why we're reaching for food. Am I actually hungry or not? Mm-hmm. So if we start at the beginning and we can notice the trigger, great, game on. If we can't, we don't have to figure that out. We can just move right to the behavior itself, because the behavior result relationship, that's what drives future behavior, not the trigger itself.
Mm-hmm.
Does that get it?
Yeah, that's helpful. To clarify, the awareness practice step, so this is a question. To clarify, the awareness practice step is to be aware of trigger, behavior, and then reward. And you're saying no, actually. I think we're heavily conditioned to be looking for triggers as clinicians, right? Help us shake that. So you're talking about let's find that behavior. There's not as much pressure to figure out what those triggers or activating stimuli are.
Yeah. So as you said earlier, we can do things like say the word fat, 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 fat. So we become, okay with saying that word. Let's try that. It's not about the trigger. It's not about the trigger. It's not about the trigger. Right. So if we repeat that enough, we can start to at least wake ourselves up to the conditioning, or maybe the story that I got to figure out what the trigger is. You don't. Okay. So don't worry about it. There was some some movie that I love. I got 2 words for you. Forget about it, right? So if you're worried about the trigger, I got 2 words for you. Forget about it.
All right. I think that was the big thing. There's lots of questions, but not around that. So we'll put that to those to the side for now.
Great. Yeah, we can certainly circle back as we
Yes.
go through. All right. So everybody, your mission, should you choose to accept it, it's about 12:40 my time, 11:40 Central, 9:40 Pacific, or wherever in the world you are. It's 20 before the hour. We're going to take 10 minutes, and I'm going to have you map out as many of your, start with eating habits, but then you can extend this to other habits to make sure you've got the habit mapping down. So you can, if it's easiest, you can download, we've got a free habit mapper. It's just mapmyhabit.com. Maybe somebody can pop that in the chat for folks. There's a PDF that you can download that gives instructions on mapping out habits. You don't even need that. You can just pull out a piece of paper and you can just write down trigger, behavior, result. Thank you, Maddie. And so start with eating habits. What are your eating habits? You can also extend this to your patients or your clients. Like if they've been struggling and you know them well, you can kind of bring up their story and see if you can map out some of their habit loops or the pieces of them. Again, what's the behavior? What's the result? And if you can't fill in all of the pieces yet, that's fine. But the key here is we're going to take 10 minutes, make sure that we truly understand the process of the mapping, right? What's the trigger? Least important part. What's the behavior? Very important. And what's the result? And then we will come back at about 10 to the hour. And if you are a brave soul, I'm going to have a couple of folks voice some of the habit mapping that they've come up with. The details aren't important. The process is the critical piece to map out. So we will, and if it's a great time, if you need to take a bio break and you've already done, quickly mapped out a habit, give yourself 10 minutes to stretch, do a bio break, or you can map as you do your bio break, however you want to do this. And we will reconvene in 10 minutes. Okay. Hopefully everybody is back and had a chance to start mapping out some of these habit loops. So Adrian, what I'd like to do at this point is to take a couple of examples of people mapping out habit loops. So I don't know the best way to pick people. If somebody wants to raise their hand if they want to share a habit loop that they've mapped out. And we can take 3 or 4 of these just to make sure that that we've got the concept down.
Sounds great. So just as a heads up to everyone, we are recording this and we will have this on the shelf. And so we just want you to know that this will be part of the recording. And you can reach out to us if you have any questions about that. And we can always edit something if we absolutely have to, but if you'd prefer to stay out of the spotlight, please do so. All righty. All right, let's see. It looks like we've got Donna Ray, who still has their hand raised. So Donna Ray, we'd love to hear from you.
I've just promoted Donna to a panelist, so they should be able to unmute shortly.
Great, Donna. If you want to unmute yourself, just share your mapping. That'd be great.
All right, thank you. My trigger, this is food related.
Mm-hmm.
I believe my trigger is predominantly a thought. And generally it happens at night before I go to bed.
Mm.
And then I have an image of where my favorite food is. And I go to that food.
Okay.
So the behavior I want to change is I do not want to eat peanut butter hiding in my pantry.
Mm-hmm.
And zoning out and because of the suffering that causes me after I do it, right? Shame, guilt, the reinforcement immediately is that gratification. It's soothing, the salt, the sugar. And while I was writing the third part of the map, I had an immediate feeling of sadness of my mother and that connection between the peanut butter and time I would spend with my mother as a child. It just came up. So I was rather surprised about that.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, because this is something I've been struggling with my friends, talking about this obsession with peanut butter before I go to bed.
Yeah. 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 Well, thank you for mapping that out for us. And it's, you mapped it out very clearly and very concisely as well. Bookmark that piece around the results, because we're going to double click on that in the second step. Not that you have to share the second step reflection piece, but this is going to be a critical piece for the habit change process. So thank you for highlighting that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Great.
All right, we also had Kimberly raise their hand. So Kimberly, you can go ahead and unmute.
Oh, I discovered 2 habits around eating. And the one that was most impactful for me was the behavior was eating past full. And the result is an uncomfortable stomach and disgust with myself. And the trigger, this was surprising for me. The trigger was, I don't want what I'm eating to stop because I like it. I don't want it to stop. And so, but the result, that result of ew, So this was of the two that I put together, this one really struck me.
Yeah, isn't that interesting that we don't want what we'd like to stop, but by continuing it, the liking stops. Yeah, yeah. So we'll talk more about that also in the second step. There's something that I talk about in the hunger habit called the pleasure plateau. And you're describing it beautifully, the pleasure plateau and going off the cliff of overindulgence. So thank you for sharing that.
All right, next we have Daniela.
Please.
Hi. It was really interesting doing this exercise because I was like, oh my gosh, this is my behavior. I don't plan meals. So my husband takes over. So I think the trigger for me is that I want somebody to take care of me.
Hmm.
So the other thing the other thing I wrote down is, I don't have time to eat. And when I don't have time to eat, it results in eating sugar of some kind. It's because it's always pastry. If I'm going to eat something, pastry or chocolate, it's always something sweet. And so, so that I actually don't take the time on one sense, because then I get to eat the sweet that I want to eat. And when I was listening to the other lady, what I was thinking to myself, because I did another one where I put down my behavior is to eat the cake, and then the reward is that I'm happy. And then I was thinking, who made me happy was my grandmother. She was the one that always had consistency and fed me cake and fed me sweets. And when I was with her, she's my happy memory. So the other memories in my family are all about conflict when it comes to food.
Well, and you're highlighting something that I'm guessing a lot of folks can relate to, which is, and for any folks that are out there that are grandparents, they're often in this unique situation where they get to spoil the grandkids. and often that comes in the form, like food is love. And
Yes.
so it's whether they're doing something home cooked or making cookies or taking them out for ice cream, they get to spoil the kids. And we can look at, again, this isn't for us to shame ourselves or think, oh no, but we can look to see how else we can provide love and spoiling that doesn't accidentally set up some unhealthy habits for the kids down the road. Yeah. So thank you for bringing this forward. It's really important. Maybe we'll take two more.
All right, next on the list is Jenny. Jenny, you can unmute.
Oh, hello. Thank you for this seminar. It's really interesting and I'm learning a lot, so I really appreciate that. I had a couple of things and I wasn't quite sure how to put it. So I find I start off at times with boredom or stress or wanting to have some newness to my very routine day. And what I tend to do is I like snacking, something that is crispy or whatever. So I will do that. And then I enjoy it. It gives me satisfaction and enjoyment and removes my negative emotions about the boredom and the stress and, oh, it's just the same old thing. But then immediately it's followed with guilt. So I stay away from it for a while because I know that feeling of guilt and I don't want to feel that anymore. But ultimately, there are times when, again, the stress and the overwhelming boredom of my routine gets to me. And I say, well, I haven't had it for so long. It's okay. I can just do it. I know I can control it. So, yeah, I'd like to get off that because,
Well, so two things. One is stay tuned, and we'll talk about how to work with it. The second is that you're highlighting something where often when something has, it's been a while since we've done something, our brain forgets what the result was. And so we've, and it likes, we like to remember positive things. And so our brains will preference oh yeah, I like that type of snacky food as compared to the guilt that comes with it. We'll be like, it wasn't that bad. And then we get there again and we're like, oh yeah, it was. I forgot. I don't know if that fits with your experience.
Yeah. And then the disappointment with myself is even worse, right?
Yeah.
Because I know I've
We're like,
been
oh, I
there.
should have remembered.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah. So our brains are not great at remembering all these inconvenient truths.
And here I thought our brain was, through negative bias. We were engineered for negative bias. So there you go.
So and both are true. So the engineer for negative bias is really helping us out of survival in the immediate moment. But it's harder to remember things. There's this whole delay discounting science that you're probably familiar with as well, that it's hard to imagine results in the future the farther they are because it's hard. Our brain, there's more uncertainty. Our brain can't remember, it's like can't imagine itself in the future as it can right now. So the negativity bias comes in around, it's more important to avoid things that could kill us, especially right now, than it is to remember things that can help us. That being said, guilt doesn't generally kill us. It just feels bad. I think maybe a concrete example of this is with negativity bias related to food. We can all imagine this. How quickly, if something is rotten or spoiled, how quickly our mouths will eject it before we even consciously aware of it, as compared to chocolate or some fine food where we eat the chocolate and we're like, oh yeah, there's this, some people get really nerdy about it. They're like, oh, I can taste the whatever, in chocolate or wine or whatever. We don't, if it's what is it? Arsenic or cyanide? I can never remember. I think it's arsenic that tastes like almonds. We're not like, oh yeah, arsenic really does taste like almonds, doesn't it? That's out of our mouth before we're consciously aware of it because it's helping us survive. So I think that's a more clear-cut example of negativity bias. And that's the way I like to think about it, because otherwise it can get confusing, like you're pointing out, Jenny. So thank you for sharing that. Let's take one more and then we'll go on to step 2.
All right, the next one on my list is Une, and you should be able to unmute now.
Please.
Hi, so my mapping for my food intake would start with my trigger is unfinished food, especially when it's like a gathering of festivals or even just a small chit chat with my friends. Whenever there's unfinished food, I'll have this immense guilt feeling. So my behavior would be I force feed myself to finish all the food, even though I'm already full. And the reward is finally I would feel accomplished as if it's like a task that I need to do. But at the same time, I would feel stressed because I know that I'm overeating, but I'm feeling accomplished for finishing the food.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thank you for mapping that. You're highlighting what may also fall in the category of completion bias, where it's like we've got 3 things checked off on our list and we just got to get that 4th thing. And then we feel so accomplished by checking that off. Food can fall into the same trap, let's say, where, oh, I still have food on my plate. We've been conditioned, oh, finish it, even though our body is saying, I don't need that. I have had it enough. And yet there's that struggle between, our body saying no and our brain saying yes. So does that fit with your experience?
Yeah, because I would be feeling very, very guilty for not finishing it. So I would force myself to finish it.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, so that may even go beyond the completion bias where it's like if we're conditioned to like gotta eat all the food, to me it was the clean plate club, where, we would 4 kids in my family and we were always, gotta eat your food. So thank you for highlighting that. All right.
Thank you too.
So but we'll move on now to step 2, but just to summarize, the first step is actually the easiest. And I find this clinically, as a lot of you are highlighting, it doesn't take that long. Sometimes as we take the time to map these out, we can have surprises along the way, like, oh, as a couple of folks highlighted, oh, associate peanut butter, with this, or, my grandparents spoiling me, or this or that. So, and just knowing those is, fun discoveries. But when it comes to changing the habits, this is where the second step is actually the most critical step. If we can't see what the habit is, we can't change it. So the first step is critical, but it's not the end. Just by mapping it out, we're not going to necessarily change it. Often people get in this mindset of, oh, now I can see what it is, and they feel empowered, and they think, well, I'm just going to change it. And they get into this habit of trying to apply force or willpower. So if that is the case for you, or if you've had clients or patients for whom that is the case, you can ask, how well and how often has this worked? And then you can ask, okay, is there a different way? Of course, the answer is yes. So let's get into that different way. So I'm going to go into a little bit of neuroscience here. Think of step 2 as the beginning of the end. I'm going to show you a short video that kind of highlights the most concise way that I can think of illustrating the point. So we put together a short video. This is also, you can access it on my website. It's free anytime as a resource, or if you want to have your patients understand this, that's why we put this together. All right, here we go.
Why does your brain prefer cake to broccoli? This seems like a simple solution. Cake tastes better, but it's not as simple as you might think. And the real answer gives us insights into why we act certain ways and how to break bad habits. Ready to dive in? Let's start with why and how our brains form habits. The why is simple. Habits free up our brain to learn new things. Think about it. If every day you woke up in the morning and had to relearn how to walk, put your clothes on, tie your shoes, make coffee, cook food, and eat, you'd be exhausted before you even finished breakfast. Habits help us learn something once, and then we can automatically act that behavior out without thinking. Simple, right? So how are habits formed? Notice how every single action you take doesn't become a habit. Your brain has to choose what to lay down as a habit and what not to do again. How do we do this? We learn a habit based on how rewarding the behavior is. This is called reward-based learning, and it has 3 components: a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. Let's say you see your shoelaces untied, that's the trigger, tie your shoes, that's the behavior, and then don't trip when you walk, that's the reward. The more rewarding a behavior is, the stronger the habit. In fact, our brains set up a hierarchy of behaviors based on their reward value. The behavior with the bigger reward is the one we act out. This goes all the way back to our caveman brains that are set up to help us get the most calories we can so we can survive. For example, sugar and fat have lots of calories. So when we eat cake, part of our brain thinks calories, survival, so we start to prefer cake over broccoli. Our brains remember which foods are more rewarding, which is why our parents never served dessert at the same time as dinner. Given a choice, we'd fill up on cake before we ate our vegetables. But it's not just calories that count. Our brains also learn the reward value of people, of places, and things. For example, think back to all of the birthday parties you went to as a kid. Your brain combines all of that information, the taste of the cake as well as all the fun you had with your friends, the presents, and the ice cream, of course. All of this information goes into a single composite reward value. And this reward value gets reinforced with each party we go to. When you are grown up and see a piece of cake, you don't have to relearn what cake tastes like or remember any of the fun from the times you ate it. The association you learned as a kid kicks in. You just know that eating cake makes you feel good, and it triggers that automatic and habitual response to eat it. Think of learning a habit as set and forget. Set the reward value and forget about the details. This is also why it's so hard to break bad habits. If you're trying to cut down on automatically eating every piece of cake you see, what is the standard advice that you get? Well, use your willpower and just don't eat it. Think of all the calories in what? Think your way out of eating? This might work sometimes, but more often than not, in the long run, it fails. Why? That's not how our brains work. To change a behavior, you can't just focus on the behavior itself. You have to address the felt experience of the rewards of the behavior. If it were as easy as thinking our way out of a behavior, we'd just tell ourselves to stop smoking, stop eating cake, stop yelling at our kids when we're stressed or whatever, and it would work. But it doesn't. The only sustainable way to change a habit is to update its reward value. That's why it's called reward-based learning after all. So how do we update reward values and break bad habits? One simple ingredient: awareness. To change a habit, our brains need new information so they can see that whatever the value that they had learned in the past is outdated. By paying attention to the results of the behavior in the present moment, we can jolt our brain out of habit autopilot and see and feel exactly how rewarding or unrewarding it is for us right now. This new information resets the reward value on that old habit and moves better behaviors into automatic mode. Here's an example. In our Craving to Quit program, we don't tell users to force themselves to stop smoking or that smoking's bad for them. They already know this. Instead, we teach people to pay attention when they smoke. Most people start smoking when they're a teenager, so they've laid down a strong reward value for cigarettes, being young and cool at school, rebelling against their parents, all of that. We have them pay attention when they smoke so they can see how rewarding smoking is for them right now. What do they notice? After doing this exercise, someone in our program commented, "Smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck." Did you notice how this person paid attention? They weren't thinking, "Oh, smoking's bad for me." They brought awareness to their experience of smoking as they were doing it, noticing the smell and tasting the chemicals in cigarettes. Yeah, smoking tastes like crap when we actually pay attention. This kind of awareness helps us reset the reward value in our brain, which in turn helps us break that habit. Can awareness really help us change deeply ingrained habits? We wondered the same thing, so we actually did the scientific studies to see for ourselves. In our Eat Right Now program, where people use an app-based mindfulness training to learn to pay attention when eating, we built in a craving tool to measure exactly how rewarding certain eating behaviors are. The craving tool has them pay careful attention as they overeat or eat a certain type of food so that their brain can accurately update the reward value. We have found that it takes as few as 10 times of using the craving tool for people to update the reward value of their habitual behaviors and change their habits. In one study of our Eat Right Now program, we saw a 40% reduction in craving-related eating. Just think about this for a moment. This is huge. These studies show that people are no longer habitually reacting to their triggers. They don't have to force themselves to stop. They can move beyond willpower. How are they doing this? They're leveraging their brain's strength, the very same processes that set up their old habitual behaviors to break free from them. Now that you know how your brain actually works, it's time to update your approach to changing habits. Quit relying on willpower and go to the source, reward value. And don't forget, a little awareness goes a long way.
Okay, so that's really all the neuroscience you need to know about changing habits, whether it's anxiety, eating, smoking, or whatnot. And just to put a put a period behind this, this depends on this part of our brain in the prefrontal cortex called the orbitofrontal cortex. And that orbitofrontal cortex is what's determining this reward value, broccoli versus chocolate. And then in my mind, if I eat dark chocolate, definitely dark chocolate. There are formulas that actually can describe this process exquisitely well. This goes back to the 1970s when Rescorla and Wagner came up with their famous formula that we still use today in research and publish on it for reinforcement learning. Don't worry about the details of the math here, but you can see it's a relatively simple formula. It's basically that the current reward value is based on the previous reward value, right? How high in the hierarchy it is, plus an error term. This error term can go one of two ways. We call this positive or a negative prediction error. So for example, if there's a new bakery that opens up in my neighborhood, I don't know how good their chocolate cake is. So if I go and eat their chocolate cake and it's like the best chocolate cake I've ever had, I get what's called a positive prediction error. Not that there was something that went wrong, but it just means it was different than expected, better than expected, in fact. That's where the positive prediction error comes in. I get a dopamine spritz in my brain, and I learn, hey, this is a good bakery. On the other hand, if I go in and I'm like, not that great, they could do better, I get a negative prediction error. I also learn dopamine spritz that says, hey, not that great, don't come back here. We can leverage this to change behavior in our daily lives, whether it's the bakery or whether it's eating, hiding in the pantry and eating peanut butter at night, or anything else that might not be helpful for us. I want to highlight, if there isn't something unrewarding about the behavior, we're not going to change it. But if there is, we can actually change it pretty quickly. And so to study this, my lab built this craving tool into our Eat Right Now program where we could have people basically collect data. So as they overate, as they ate junk food, we could have them pay careful attention. It was basically a mindful eating exercise. And then we could measure the change in reward value. Ready for this? Check this out. This is our first study. 10 times. Within 10 times of somebody doing this, the reward value drops below 0. They're already shifting their behavior. Now, this makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint because we don't have 20 times to get chased by the tiger or have something dangerous happen to learn that it's dangerous. Our brains have to learn quickly. So our brains are very neuroplastic. They're good at adapting, but the adaptation in this case comes from awareness. If it's a habit, by definition, we're going to do it automatically. So we've got to flip out of habit mode, bring awareness in, and ask simple questions like, what am I getting from this? This is our first study. We replicated it in a larger community sample of over 1,000 people. Same result, just the error bars get smaller. Goes below 0, reward value goes below 0 very quickly, and people shift their behavior. A couple of examples of what that's like. This person said, dear sneaky habit loop that says eating junk food is fun, I am on to you, right? When you pay attention, You can't pretend that something is good. I think of this as the Santa Claus effect, where, if the kid believes in Santa Claus, the parents take the kid to the mall to figure out what presents they want for Christmas, and the kid grabs Santa Claus's beard. You can see the parents going, no, because as soon as they figure out that this is just some guy paid to be Santa Claus in the mall, the gig is up. You can't go back. And the same is also true whether it's overeating or eating junk food or something like that. It's not, I've actually had people jokingly come to me in our program saying, you should have warned me that I'm not going to like this anymore. Now, just to be clear, it's not that ice cream isn't going to taste good or chocolate isn't going to taste good. In fact, if we pay attention, we might notice just how good something tastes. At the same time, if something isn't that great, we're going to notice that too. For example, I used to be addicted to eating gummy worms. I go into detail in this in The Hunger Habit. And I started paying attention. And I realized that they were kind of tasting like petroleum to me. And they were just too sweet and making me want to eat more and all this. And so I became disenchanted with the gummy worms, not because I told myself that I shouldn't eat them. I knew, because I would eat the whole bag. I knew what would happen. I just couldn't force myself to stop. When I started paying attention, just like this person said, I'm on to you. And this is what starts to happen. As somebody put it, a shift is happening. I'm choosing more healthy foods. The sugary things are less attractive. Satiety is now coming into focus. What this highlights is what we call developing the disenchantment database, meaning that as we pay attention, if something is not rewarding, we're going to become disenchanted with it, and it's going to be much easier to shift out of that behavior. As we develop that disenchantment database, we can also draw upon it, because our brain, as a prediction machine, right? Our brain's going to pick future behavior by simulating doing that behavior. And the way to simulate it is based on what we've done in the past. So if I'm going to, say, oh, I've just eaten, I'm not very hungry. Here's 3 scoops of ice cream versus 1 scoop of ice cream. I can simulate what's 3 versus 1 like. And if I've done both in the past and I've paid attention, especially at that level of hunger, I can see, 3 scoops might be a little much as compared to 1 scoop, which is going to be, scratch that itch of sweetness for dessert. So that disenchantment database is critical for helping us shift behavior. And the only way we can develop that is through awareness. That's why step 1 is awareness, aware of the habit loop. Step 2 is awareness, that awareness that comes and helps us really see very clearly what the results of the behavior are. I'll illustrate this with an example, and then we're going to do an exercise and explore this for ourselves. So my patient, who had panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, 400 pounds. As I mentioned, I sent him home after that first visit to start mapping out his anxiety habit loops. And what he started, in 2 weeks later, he comes back. And actually, the first thing he says to me when he comes back to my office is, "Hey, doc, I lost 14 pounds. And I looked at him because I hadn't remembered that we'd talked about weight loss at our previous visit. And we actually hadn't. We'd only focused on anxiety. And he said, yeah, we hadn't talked. He could see my confusion. He said, yeah, we hadn't really talked about weight loss, but I was mapping out these habit loops. And I realized that anxiety is triggering me to eat fast food. And the fast food, I used to eat it, as a way to escape, but I realized that it's actually giving me health anxiety. He had a lot of health anxiety related to his hypertension, his sleep apnea, and all that. And he said, I just saw that clearly, and I was not excited to eat fast food anymore. So he said, I stopped eating fast food. And he had already lost 14 pounds because he used to eat a lot of fast food. And what he highlighted, he said, this is the easiest weight loss I've ever had. He went on to lose over 100 pounds. He's still losing. This was 3-4 years ago now. He's gone on to continue to slowly and healthily lose weight, coming back into a healthier range for him. And he said it's the easiest it's ever been. So, that joke about, people say, oh, I've lost 1,000 pounds. It's been that same 10 pounds over and over where I lose it and regain it, lose it, regain it. He'd lived that for 30 years. And he was now in this place where, it's a very different place for him. Let's just put it that way. It's not that same 10 pounds over and over and over. So I'm going to pause here. There's a bit more concept in step 2 with regard to the neuroscience, but I'm going to just open it up. Are there any conceptual questions about step 2 before we go into an exercise around mapping this piece out, specifically the behavior result relationship? So if there are any clarification questions, we'll take those. And then if not, we'll dive right into the exercise.
I don't think any clarification questions related to step 2. So if you want to dive into the exercise, and then if we have time to kind of pan out again, we can integrate some more general questions, but it's okay if we don't have time to. I know we're pushing it.
Perfect. Yeah, just to keep an eye on time for us to keep going. What I'll do is I'll give you, we'll do 7, 8, it's 28 after 7 minutes to map out some of the results of your habit loop. So take your previous habit loop, ask the simple question, what did I get from this? So some folks were already highlighting it. It felt guilty, felt this, felt that. Keep it in your embodied experience. Don't focus too much on the thinking, because the feeling body is much stronger than the thinking brain. Keep it embodied. Write down those results so you can see really clearly what that cause and effect relationship is. What's the behavior? What's the result of the behavior? And you're not looking to find bad things. You're just giving an honest appraisal of what's happening. There could be things like, oh, brief relief, it feels good. There could be this as well. So you're going to map all that stuff out in the next 6 minutes now. And then we're going to come back and I'll have a couple of people share their experience to make sure we're all on the same page before we go on. So we'll come back at 35 after. Okay. So any brave souls like to share what they discovered from this second step, the mapping? What am I getting from this? Looks
All
like
right, we have Hazel who raised their hand.
Please.
Hazel, you should be able to unmute now.
Did that work?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm in shock. I took the three whatever triggers or the three categories. I don't know what the words are. Eating, worrying, and negative self-talk.
Okay.
And the behaviors were different, but the reward was exactly the same on all three.
Oh.
I can't believe it. I felt hot, but I had to.
So what was the reward? You're keeping me in suspense here.
Oh, for eating, the reward was it started with beat myself up, flog myself. Oh, this is very familiar. This is exactly the values of my family. Not to overeat and feel bad about it. But underneath that was tired and go to sleep. And it was the same for worry and negative self-talk. So, and that's just amazing because I've been tired and napping and sleeping for 67 years. I don't know how many. And I don't want to. I want to be awake, live awake, or something like that.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're gonna talk about that actually in the third step around bringing in some superpowers that we refer to as kindness and curiosity. And so being kind to ourselves and being curious, like, oh, what is it that I need right now so that we can care for ourselves and therefore be awake and be there to care for others as well. So thank you, Hazel.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll take one more.
All right, next on my list, I have Susan. Susan, you should be able to unmute now.
Hey, well, I was really surprised because the first thing I went in expecting it to turn up as chocolate, but it didn't. It came up as not being able to eat foods that are generally considered healthy. If I eat salads or I can't come near a raw vegetable, sometimes even fixing them for someone else gets my sinuses a mess, but mainly my esophagus hurts a lot. And what I came up with, so rewards, well, they like the reward that goes with the chocolate that I thought I was going to start with was I don't have to eat those things. I can eat more chocolate and not gain weight. But the bottom line under it goes back to when I was a kid. Dinner time was the time for a massive fight between my parents, and I was anorexic. And I started dating my husband at 14, and he took on the job of trying to get food down me. And that worked. I married him, and then I was fine until I got in a really stressful job on a Navy ship. And commanding officer was known as a screamer. And I went back into it hurt to eat. It started on salad, having to eat with him. And I went into, I couldn't eat that. I got down to where all I could get down was tapioca. This time it was the doctors who took on trying to fix me and get me to be able to eat. And for 30 years, no gastroenterologist has been able to figure out why my esophagus hurts so much and goes into spasm if I try to eat a lot of these healthy foods. So it has been a real eye-opener. I think where I go from here.
Yeah, well, and just in the interest of time, we'll keep this brief, but if I'm hearing what you're saying, often if there's no clear medical explanation for something, no physical explanation, I shouldn't say often, there can be this learned conditioned behavior, right? And it's amazing how strong these physical reactions can be, if that's the case for you. I don't want to assume anything. And for people for whom that is the case, the good news is that if we've learned it, we can unlearn it in a way, through a process that's compassionate and kind to ourselves in the process. It really, I find it very helpful to at least, if we can see how these things happen, it gives us hope that we can unwind some of those. So thank you for sharing that. Because the second step is so important, let's take one more, very briefly. If somebody else wants to share what they've mapped out, like what's the result? What have they gotten when they mapped out this habit loop?
Next on my list is Daniela.
Please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, my definition is really coming down to food is love. Because by letting my husband take over, by me avoiding preparing meals and doing things, he's loving me when he does it. So I'm recreating grandma, my husband's grandma. Grandma's very important. And apparently I need a lot of love. And I used to laugh and tell my husband, you think food is love. It's not love, but I'm finding I'm creating love with what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for highlighting that. And I think this is actually a great segue into this third step. So thank you all for sharing, and for everybody for mapping this out yourselves. This is really the beginning. And I think I'm going to share my screen. Step 3, I think of this as the beginning of the end. Meaning that if we know our mind works, if we can map out these processes, if we can start to see that we are the old habits aren't helping us, and this is also how we can form new habits, right? So eating healthy food, if we start to see, oh, that's actually feels better, we can actually foster these in a way that comes from an embodied, direct experience as compared to our mind, where we're like, I read a book or I saw a blog or somebody did this on TikTok, and I think I should do this. But anytime there's a should in there, that's a problem, because we're stuck in our head. The feeling body, much stronger than the thinking brain, as I mentioned earlier. So how can we find rewards that are more rewarding? So key is same process. This is the oldest and the strongest process in our brain. So let's use it. Going to Einstein here again. No special talents. I'm only passionately curious. And so here we can focus in on how it feels to be curious. My lab's actually done studies on this. I don't have time to go into them, but we can explore for ourselves what feels better, fighting a craving or being curious about what that craving feels like. And so I detailed this in some of my books. Just quickly, when a patient comes into my office, I actually had a patient who came in and said, Doctor, if I don't smoke a cigarette, I feel like my head's going to explode. I panicked, to be honest, because I never had that chief complaint before. But I went to my whiteboard. That's my fallback. That's my habit, is let's draw something. So asked him to describe what head exploding feels like. And he was describing his feelings of craving, tightness, tension, burning. And I was asking him, are they getting more intense? Yes, yes, yes. So I was drawing this up arrow, and then eventually it peaked. That craving peaked, and his eyes got really wide. And I said, what happened? And he said, I usually smoke before it goes down. And I realized, oh, it goes down without me smoking. Big aha for him. Oh, I don't have to smoke to make the craving go away. If I can be with the craving, it will go away on its own. That's what curiosity is all about. That's why I think of curiosity as a superpower, because curiosity, I love this quote, James Stevens, curiosity will conquer fear even more than bravery will. So if we can turn toward that craving, we can, with curiosity, and we can notice that the craving is only made up of sensations and thoughts and emotions, it's not nearly as scary, and we can learn that it will go away on its own. I even have people time their cravings. The longest one that anybody's ever reported is 12 or 13 minutes. It's not that long. So curiosity, superpower, and it's actually what we can use to step out of these habits. So I won't have you go into this third step now, but I will just describe it. And then we'll have a few minutes at the end to just open it up for general questions and discussion. First step, awareness. You have to be aware of the habit loop. Second step, you've got to be aware of the results of the behavior to develop that disenchantment database. And then the third step is we can bring this curiosity in so that we can see that we can be with our urges to eat and be free of them by being with them. So instead of trying to do something about them, the being becomes the doing, being with. So we turn toward our experience. That's saying the only way out is through. So we turn toward our experience, or as Marcus Aurelius is reported to have said, the obstacle becomes the way. And so we bring that curiosity and we turn toward our craving and realize that it is not nearly as scary as we think that it is. When we do that, we can actually be able to open to this other question that also comes with awareness and ask ourselves, what do I need instead of what do I want? And so we can start to meet our needs instead of feeding our wants, so that we can actually nurture ourselves and we can heal ourselves and we can bring this kindness in to support ourselves instead of falling into our old habits of beating ourselves up for failing at willpower, which doesn't even probably exist. So I'm going to give you an example of this. And then because we just have about 15 minutes left, we're going to open it up to, if you reflect on your own experience, or if you have any specific questions, so that we can put this into practice in our own lives. You might have already started reading this. Somebody said, I decided to get a snack because I was tired. Even thinking about the reason for that craving is so much more than what normally happens automatically. Awareness. Well, much better. I enjoyed 4 M&Ms. Yes, 4, and I was fine. I never, ever was able to leave an open bag of M&Ms in my drawer my complete life before. That's so amazing. I just quoted this exactly. So notice this. We call this unforced freedom of choice. And this came from the mouths of participants in some of our qualitative studies. And unforced freedom of choice that arises from embodied awareness. We become aware. We ask ourselves, what do I need? And we stop before we go over that cliff of overindulgence. One more example. I'm trying to listen to my body, stopping eating when my body has had enough to eat rather than finishing what's on the plate. So we can quit the clean plate club because we see it doesn't feel good to be part of that club. It doesn't feel good. So I'm just going to summarize this in this kind of summarizes everything that we've been talking about over the last 3 hours. So we have these old habits: see food, eat food, feel guilty about eating food. We have these other habits. Oh, I need to use my willpower. See food, try to force myself not to eat the food. Feels better because it's aligned with my goals, but it still feels forced, depleting at best. There's another way. This is what the neuroscience suggests. See the food, get curious. Oh, why am I reaching for food? If there's a craving to eat, get curious. If there's a craving to eat, get curious. Oh, what does this craving feel like? So we can shift from the, oh no, I have to fight this, to the, oh, this is what a craving feels like. And the result, that craving goes away. If we're not hungry, we don't have to eat. Maybe we don't overeat. Maybe we shift from, for me, it was gummy worms to blueberries. But this unforced freedom of choice becomes the new path, and the path that can become more ingrained because it's natural and it leverages the strength of our brains. So I'll just end how my patients do. Obviously, if they didn't do well, I wouldn't use them as examples. My patient with binge eating disorder, took her about 4 months. She shifted out of that behavior, out of that habit. And she said, I feel like I've got my life back. I can eat a single piece of pizza and actually enjoy it. And I love that because it highlights it's not about the trigger. It's not avoiding triggers. Pizza still tastes good. But she realized it's my relationship to pizza. So she changed that relationship. She healed herself. She changed her relationship to herself. And then she could eat a single piece of pizza. As I mentioned, my patient, who's lost over 100 pounds, still losing weight. I won't belabor the point, but you get the idea. Awareness, awareness, awareness. Map out the habit loop, step 1. Ask ourselves, what am I getting from this? Feel into it. It will tell us everything we need to know. Feeling body much stronger than thinking brain. We become disenchanted. Step 3, we step out of the old habit. We bring curiosity in, we bring kindness in. We ask ourselves, what do I need? We meet those needs instead of feeding those wants. As this person put it, what's most interesting to me is how we define the rewards. In the past, the reward of eating right has been weight loss, but it was more often than not short-lived because I hadn't made real process changes in my daily life. Here it feels like the reward is defined differently and the weight loss is a side effect. The reward here is, for a lack of better expression, a more balanced life or inner peace. Peace definitely feels better. I'll end with this quote from one of my favorite poems, Rumi. There's a worm addicted to eating grape leaves. Suddenly he wakes up, call it grace, whatever, something wakes him. And he's no longer a worm. He's the entire vineyard and the orchard too, the fruit, the trunks, a growing wisdom and joy that does not need to devour. We all have this capacity. It's not about willpower. It's about awareness. It's about curiosity. It's about kindness. So speaking of kindness of others, so many people helped with this work. I just list them all, especially the participants in our studies, the NIH that gave us most of our funding. And of course, shameless plug of self-promotion. If you want to read all about it, about these stories and more, you can certainly pick up The Hunger Habit, local library, independent bookseller, Audible, whatever works for you if you're interested. So I'll stop there. And we've got a few minutes left. So if you've got any final questions or want to share your experience where you're seeing the dots connecting for you, we've got, and Adrienne, how long do we actually have time? Because I know you have a few things at the end for the folks getting CEs.
Yeah, we'll just have a reel at the end, so we don't need to carve out any time for that. So we have about 7 minutes for anything final that you want to do.
Great. So maybe if there are any questions that line up, why don't we take a few of those?
Sounds great. So there were a few folks who got confused between step 1 and step 2. Mm-hmm. So do you want to speak to, I think the rewards being part of step 1, mm-hmm. We're having trouble distinguishing then exactly what is step 2.
Yeah, let's simplify it because there is a bleed over from step 1 to step 2, right? So officially step 1 is the mapping. Step 2 is diving into the reward, the behavior reward relationship. But you can think of step 1 as what's the behavior? Like, why am I reaching for food? And keep it super simple. Identify what that behavior is, right? Am I eating because I'm hungry or because of something else? Step 2, dive into the results. What am I getting from this behavior? I think and you're missing nothing there. It's not oversimplifying, but that might help.
Perfect. There were a few folks who were chatting about what happens when there isn't a problem in the reward, because you talk about how we identify the reward, good, bad, and ugly. It's just honest, whatever the reward is, that's honest. So if we have clients or ourselves and we're just feeling the good in the reward stage, earlier you said behavior is probably not going to, behavior change is probably not going to be, not going to come. Is that right? Are we getting that correct?
Yes. Yes. So for our brains to want to change, there needs to be an impetus to change. So if we're not, if there's no, like, there's nothing from our physiologic or emotional standpoint that's wrong with the behavior, it's not going to change. So in fact, I like dark chocolate even more now, right? Now that I pay attention, right? So I'm not going to not like dark chocolate. There's no problem in me eating dark chocolate. If I eat a whole bar of dark chocolate, my stomach's going to tell me that that was a problem. I've gone over the cliff of overindulgence. And so if somebody internally, they're like, but I just love overeating. I love to bring in motivational interviewing practices at this point. Great. Why don't you do it more? I just did this with somebody yesterday on their podcast. He was talking about eating chips, bowl of chips. I was like, why don't you eat more? Right. And so that can help highlight where somebody's going to hit their pleasure plateau. And it also can uncover things that they might not have been conscious of, or at least verbal about, where they're like, oh, well, it actually, it doesn't feel that good. Oh, let's explore that more. So you can uncover where the downsides are that somebody might not have noticed or wanted to acknowledge in the past. But I love the curiosity that comes with motivational interviewing, the rolling with the resistance and all that. It's like, we're in this together, discovering. And it's like, no judgment, right? If you want to keep eating, let's explore this. Like, why not?
Yeah.
So does that answer it?
I think so. And it also, takes us out of this role that we so often, even experienced clinicians, we're in this role of like taking responsibility for the change, and that motivational interviewing helps us move out of that. We're a co-traveler, if you will, on this experience with them, and we're not trying to force them or change them. Right.
Yeah. As we've talked about force, I wouldn't put stock in that one.
In the context of severe addiction, life-threatening stuff, this always comes up, I feel like, during your presentations, right? Because we think of, okay, just go eat that chocolate, right? Or just go eat that bag of chips is different than just go drink that bottle of whiskey, right? For a severe alcoholic. So this is all in context, right, Dr. Jud? We're taking this all in context and recognizing that acute stages of addiction where people are in life-threatening situations are going to require a whole lot of support, detox, etc.
Absolutely. So we all need to use our clinical judgment here. For example, alcohol, if somebody just goes and detoxes cold turkey, that can be life-threatening. Driving while intoxicated, all these things, we know this. So using our clinical judgment with eating, and this is also not, anorexia nervosa, one of the most lethal psychiatric issues out there. So it takes a village. This is really, I've done a lot of work with binge eating disorder, for example, right? And so if somebody's going to already going to binge anyway, it's not actually adding anything to what they're already doing. It's just adding that element of awareness in. That's the key ingredient.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So we had an interesting question about mindfulness and meditation stuff where folks who are not, and mindfulness practices don't always have to be quiet, right? But this is an example of like when folks get quiet and they're not used to getting quiet, or they're not used to being aware in that way that you're talking, that mindful awareness, people have reactions, right? It can be hyper arousing to try and do that. How do you handle that with clients and patients?
Yeah, two things. One is, notice how this entire process that we went through, none of it requires meditation. So if somebody isn't into meditation, doesn't feel like they can meditate, is allergic to meditation, they still have to eat. So pay attention while you eat, right? Put away distractions, bring that awareness in there. the other thing is if somebody's curious and they want to start meditating and they notice that, their mind is a little nuts where they haven't noticed that before, that is very normal. And just helping people, warning people about that is helpful. In fact, in our apps, we have a whole module called Muddy Waters. And I think of it as, you go through this river that's kind of doesn't look like it's that muddy, but as soon as you start walking through there, you kick up all this mud. And that's similar. The analogy is we start meditating and suddenly our mind, we're like, wow, where'd all this dirt come from? Well, we've been often ignoring or not noticing what's already been there the whole time. So it's not like things are getting worse. We're just noticing what the natural tendencies of the mind are. The good news is, as we learn to work with all of those, as we develop our distress tolerance, that mud doesn't get laid down on the bottom. It just keeps flowing. And so these little dirt particles are just little dirt particles. And so we learn to work with them and also learn not to have it get as muddy down the road. So I just let people know ahead of time, hey, it can get a little muddy. That's okay. That's normal. That's expected. You're going to develop these tools to be able to be with that, and it will help the dirt flow down the road.
Yeah. And it seems like such an important piece to, what did you call the rewards that weren't so great? They're like disenchanted or something like that.
We become disenchanted. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like part of that mud might be some important pieces of awareness that we need to see in order to be aware of the disenchanted rewards that are so important to breaking the habit loop.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And often we don't want to look at things that are unpleasant.
Yeah. This is the last question. Any observed differences between the participants who were successful in Eat Right Now and those who struggled? Anything to learn from that?
That's a really good question. We haven't done secondary analyses on our studies where we've gone back and followed up with folks that have struggled. We've done some work with our Unwinding Anxiety program where we've found, and we're still doing this work, we can actually predict a baseline who might struggle just based on a few psychological questions. And a lot of it, we're distilling it down to this category of basically how I hesitate to categorize it even, but it's where people are not comfortable. I'm not even going to categorize it because I don't want people thinking, oh no. Yeah. The bottom line is we're starting to do some of that analysis. We don't know exactly yet. But I think overall, helping people develop distress tolerance skills is a good thing. I'll just put it that way as a hint of where people might struggle. Yeah. And the good news is we can help people do that. One of the best ways to do that is give them information because our brains don't like uncertainty. So we create some certainty there just by helping people understand that they don't like, that they might be intolerant of uncertainty or, allergic to distress. So for example, and then building some skills like mindfulness is really helpful here for learning to be with emotions, be with thoughts, be with sensations instead of reacting to them.
Yeah. And even just the exercise of, I'm in a habit loop, right? It just seems revolutionary, right? And recognizing.
Yeah. And in a nutshell, we can even just look at that internal voice. If it's, oh no, that's where we're turning away, resisting, and we can learn to flip that to, oh, that's it in a nutshell. That's curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Well, Dr. Jud, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much for being here today. Please enjoy the 14 days that you can check out this training, order the hunger habit, and everyone have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And we'll see you next time on your next PESI training.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks.